Well, hey there, you're on the internet. Please excuse the bandages, and welcome to the Triple N Network, where all you newbie nib nerds can find all the news you'll need. Let's look at an ink today, shall we? Now, today's ink is by a brand that I've probably had the longest familiarity with. I was given fountain pens as a child, supposedly to help with my handwriting and learn how to write properly. Sorry, so often I was given these little tins of Herbin ink, and I have like a million of these rolling around. And so the two brands that I probably was most given were those and then Mont Blanc, just because they were easy to find in cartridges, and people would give them to me like, oh, oh, she needs these. And the thing is, I didn't know that there were better things out there for a long time, and then when I did, I don't think there's a single Herbin ink that I gravitate towards anymore. Yeah, it's left a bad taste in my mouth. I've made no secret of the fact that this brand is not something that I particularly love, because for the most part the inks are very undersaturated. And I think this ink in particular, this one today, is up there with the worst offenders. And today's ink is Herbin's Gris Nuage. Or I'm just going to call it gray because my French is terrible, but I'm pretty sure it means like gray clouds or gray fog. I never studied French, but yeah, as you can probably tell, it is a very light gray. We'll get into it, but yeah, so as I was saying, the two brands I'm most familiar with are Herbin, or longest familiar with, are Herbin and Mont Blanc. And Mont Blanc's gray is called Oyster Gray. And Oyster Gray, I sometimes think, is too light to read comfortably. The problem is it also does this. Mont Blanc gray, Oyster Gray, tends to turn plastics pink. And this is an original Mont Blanc Oyster Gray cartridge. But while I was doing the test, I also wanted to show some comparisons, so I also used Mont Blanc Oyster Gray in this. This is a Coeco Ice with a double broad nib. But I had Gris Nuage, or Herbin Gray, in these two pens. Again, please ignore the bandages. This is an Ohto Tasche with a fine nib, and I think in the test I probably call it a Japanese fine, but it's more like a moderate Western fine. And then I also used, because I knew this ink before I tested it, I'm familiar with it, I knew that I needed a broader nib, and so I used one of the largest ones I have. This is a quote-unquote oblique double broad, but I challenge you to find the oblique in that. This is a Knox Plato with either an oblique broad or an oblique double broad. The nibs aren't marked, but I think this is the oblique double broad. So those were the two pens I used. Yeah, let's look at some comparisons. As you can probably tell just from this, it's a very light gray. This is a very thin gray. So honestly, I had trouble finding other inks that were really comparable just because few inks are this undersaturated, but yeah, I did find Lamy Blue Black. Now, I do not know if this is the Iron Gall version of Lamy's Blue Black. I got it in a sample form, and it didn't say anything on the label. But yeah, I feel like the violet undertones going on here, you can also kind of see them in here, but again, that's darker. Monteverde Blue Black, which I hated. If you've seen my review, I absolutely hated it because it's totally undersaturated. It's unreadable in a lot of cases. It's more purple than blue black. There's no black in there whatsoever. And as you can tell, that is much darker than this. So yeah. Another horribly undersaturated ink, Parker's Quink Washable Blue. Now again, this is a blue, not a gray, but I mean, they're about as close as you get to undersaturated comparables. And then lastly, Mont Blanc's Oyster Gray, which I will be comparing to this within the test. However, here you might be able to see there's a bit more purple, and here there is purple, but there's also like gold in the darkest parts, which is a bit interesting. But yeah, so this is sometimes too light for me to comfortably read. So there's going to be some issues coming up. But yeah, let's look at the chromatography. So here's the chromatography for Herbin's gray. Sorry, there is no there is no graceful way to do this. Now the one on the right with the D, that is the one that I let dry, and the one on the left is the one that you're supposed to do, where you put the line of ink and instantly drop it in water. As you can tell, now this was something I didn't know about this ink, because I've previously when I used it I wasn't exactly putting it through its paces, but you can definitely see where that initial drop of ink was put, and you can see that it's really fighting being pushed up. And actually I don't know why I didn't outline it, but the water stopped like right here. It's not easy to see. It's mostly in the texture of the chromatography, but it's right along there. So there is a little bit of a space between where this lightest bit of ink stops and the water then stopped. Now here's where I let it dry, and I probably let it dry for only about 10 or 15 minutes. But as you can see, this dot got much darker, much less of the ink is migrating upwards, and where the water stopped, there's a much bigger separation between where the ink stopped and the water stopped. So that would imply that there's some water resistance here. Now, I'm going to zoom out just a bit. And even here, I'm just going to show some comparisons with Oyster Gray. Where actually we see fairly similar performance, where again in the dried version, again you can tell this is the dry version, where the ink stops but then the water keeps going for a bit. So that is something they have in common. However, as you can tell, it's noticeably darker, and here the purple actually separates away from this gold gray color. But yeah, so maybe someday I'll do like a full-on comparison, but this is more of a gentle comparison. Now here's where I did some chemical tests. Yep, sorry I forgot to zoom out all the way. And as you can see, the water broke it up and got it moving a little, but really not much. And the thing is, it's so watery, it looks like it's already trying to wash itself away. I'm sorry, I have a violent hatred of this ink, so I am trying to curb myself, but it's not working, obviously. Anyways, you can see that water didn't do a whole lot. It got it moving a little bit, but really not much. And I don't know if this is going to show up. Can you see that, the bleach test? It didn't completely get rid of it, it just turned it sort of like the yellow, like you see on the inside of an orange peel, you know, like the pith. How that stuff's not like totally white. Yeah, so I thought that was interesting. The ammonia pen flush got it moving maybe a little bit more than water, but not much, and since it's ammonia, it started to affect the paper, and I sopped it up pretty quickly. Kind of the same with hydrogen peroxide, except I'd say it did not get it moving much or more than water, so yeah. Okay, so on to the paper test. Top down in density, Clairefontaine 90 grams per square meter. Yeah. I have a violent hatred of this ink. So the fine, first of all, let's look at the smear on that fine. Can you even see it? Yeah, so those 4 lines, I don't even know if you can see them, those 4 lines and the smear are gone. They're gone. That's just how thin this ink is. And even this quite possibly double broad, you can barely see the smear there either. But it took 28 seconds for that double broad question mark to dry. The fine took 14. And yes, since this is a very watery ink, we do get a lot of shading. That is something that happens with severely undersaturated inks, is we do get a wide degree of shading. However, the low end of that scale, of that shading scale, is so low that it is hard to read. Look, even here in the darkest parts, we still can see every line of this, and this is a light violet line in this quadrilateral paper. This is physically hard for me to read. This is actually like uncomfortable for me to read. It is that light. And so the light color of these lines on the quad paper, the whole concept of it is that they should be able to like fade into the background, and you should be able to like ignore them, and the ink should come forward. I can't, because those lines are darker than the ink. That's just not okay. Now, this is how I like Mont Blanc Oyster Gray, when it tends to like dry out in the pen and age a bit. I like that color. once I sort of flush it out a bit more, we get normal oyster gray. Even that can be a little light for me, but yeah. Anyways, as I say, oddly long dry times, hard to read. There's no bleed, no feather, no spread, no echo, no sheen. Of course there's no echo. I mean, I can barely read it on this side of the paper. But yeah, anyways, as that chromatography kind of showed you, it does have some water resistance. The problem is, it's already so light that it's hard to read, that when you wash even a little of it away, that's almost impossible to read. So yeah, that's obnoxious, to say the least. Next up is Fabriano Eco Quats, an 85 gram per square meter paper. Yeah, it's, again, this is dot paper, so we don't have the lines, but we do have the dots, and you can see the dots, even in the darkest parts of the scrubby, all throughout. This is too light. It is literally uncomfortable for me to read. This is uncomfortable for me to read. And again, the smears are so light that it's almost hard to find them. Now the fine took 15 seconds to dry. The possibly double broad took 28. Again, oyster gray is much darker, much more noticeable, and yet it's still sometimes too light for me to read. Yeah, without the broad wet Play-Doh, I'm not able to read this, just because the fine is so light that it's hard for my eyes to focus on. But yeah, it is mildly wet. It has maybe a 6 out of 10. It does have a purple undertone. There's no bleed, no feather, no spread, no echo, no sheen. And again, the water test, there is something left behind, but it's so minor that it is very hard to read. In fact, the camera is darkening that up quite a bit. Yeah, it's not as noticeable in person. So yeah, there may be some water resistance, but really not much. Not enough to save it. Now, next up is Rhodia, 80 grams per square meter. And again, we're back to the quad paper. And again, I can see those purple lines more clearly than I can see the stuff written with the fountain pen, especially the fine. I mean, that fine is practically fading into the background. Now, yes, because it is a criminally undersaturated ink, we do have a lot of shading. We have a wide breadth of shading. Like here, again, it gets so thin when you smear it, you can't find it. You can't find it. And then here it gets dark, but it's still like purple, and you can still see every single line. I'm getting very frustrated. Anyways, the fine took 14 seconds to dry. The possibly double broad took 27. Yeah, again, oyster gray. You can still see the lines underneath it, but at least it's darker. It comes forward more. Yeah. We do get a halo effect, as you can see, especially in the scrubby, the dark outline of the wettest parts. We can see it in Wizards as well, but yeah, no bleed, no feather, no spread, no echo, no sheen. All good in that regard. But yeah, and again, water test, yes, something remains, but it's already so light that getting any lighter makes it almost impossible to read, and that fine is just essentially gone. So now, next up is Tomoe River paper, which is known for drawing out shading and sheen and dry times and echo. It is a cream paper, so I feel like it might have affected the color just a little bit, but I'm not sure I can describe how. But yeah, because of the way this paper works and the way it makes ink pool, a lot of times it can make even not super undersaturated inks start to look thin. And here, yeah, it definitely does that. So in the fine, I mean, it's barely even there. The possibly double broad, which is admittedly kind of a wet pen, and that's what I needed in order to like be able to read this at all. It's fairly wet. It might be a double broad, and it's a European nib. I mean, and even still, this is not easy for me to read. Now, that fine took 22 seconds to dry, which is pretty epic, but I mean, look at, again, the smear practically disappears. That Knox took 35. Again, we get the dark halo outline, and we get it in the writing as well. But yeah, no, I mean, there's no bleed, no feather, no spread, no echo, no sheen, and I mean, I'm not surprised that there's no echo, considering I can barely read it on this side. Why the hell would I be able to read it from the back? But yeah, this paper does love to let ink slide away when you add more water, and it actually didn't, not a whole lot, some. But considering how much this paper can just like wash away ink as if it were never there, I guess this really isn't too bad. I mean, we can see that there was fine writing there at some point. The double broad we can see a little bit, but the thing is, this is already so light. When it gets this light, it's physically painful for me to try and read. Now for the next 3 tests, I only used the fine, except to write the name. And this is the world's worst 20-pound copier paper. Yeah, so here we lose shading, essentially, and without the shading we don't get enough contrast between the light and dark areas against the white of the paper, and this becomes very difficult for me to read. Incredibly difficult for me to read. Now it took 4 seconds to dry. Yeah, there's spread. I'm going to bring this in. I want you to see the difference in line width. So line width here versus here. The line width definitely got a good bit broader. We have a woolliness. We have feathering. It's really not great. At least oyster gray. You see how like it's still darker on here. It contrasts more. There are a lot of dots of bleed. Like lots of little dots. And then eventually I'm like, I give up. But I felt the need to circle them because the ink is already so light that when it comes out the other side, it's actually hard to tell. But still. Now, more absorbent papers do tend to draw the ink in, make it harder to wash out, which is what happened here. So yes, something does remain, and it's nearly as dark as the stuff above, but it's still so light. Admittedly, it didn't feather and explode and freak out, but it would not be the easiest thing in the world to recover just because it did get lighter. Now, next up is Mead Notebook Paper, which is quite common for school children in the United States. This is the kind you'd find in a spiral notebook, not the type you'd find in like a composition notebook. And lately, this stuff has been feathering like crazy, and it does in spots. You know, like in some areas it will, but then in other areas it won't. So I don't know. But even still, like, we retain a little bit of shading on here, which is nice, and we kind of need it to be readable at all. But, yeah, it took 6 seconds to dry. This is not comfortable for me to read in the slightest. It's, it doesn't have as much spread as the 20 pounds. The line doesn't get as broad. But there's no bleed. There's maybe a little bit of echo, but no bleed, so at least there's that. And then the water test, it's pretty clear, pretty there, didn't feather, didn't explode. So if for some reason you need a ridiculously undersaturated ink and you need to use this type of paper, that could work, because, I mean, we're getting very little spread, we're not getting much feathering, we've got no bleed, and we've got a decent water test. But honestly, don't strain your eyes that much. There's better options out there. Now, lastly is Moleskine paper, which I hate because it's terrible. And, I mean, yeah, I don't even think I need to bring this in any closer. We can see the woolliness. We can see the texture of the paper. It took 5 seconds to dry, even though, I mean, clearly it's soaked in because look at what it did to the mash. Yeah, it's ugly, it's woolly, it's feathering. It's just too light. Yeah. It's ugly. It's very ugly. And we get a lot of bleed. And again, this is a fine. This is a European fine, maybe a moderate European fine, and maybe this is slightly wet, but still, I mean, it's... The fact that we can see it this clearly when the ink is this light makes you realize just how much of it came through. And despite the other papers, the other more absorbent papers doing just fine, here, this water test, it's a mess. Look, it feathered, it started to come apart, started to spread, it got lighter, it's... I hate Moleskine. Yeah, so, there you go, there's Herbin's Gris Nuage. So, it's probably one of the most undersaturated inks I've ever encountered in my life. And I would have very happily gone the rest of my life without using it again, but... eventually I'm going to run out of ink, so I figured might as well get it over with. It does have a soft violet color. It does behave fairly well on cheap papers, but yeah, it's just too light. It is just too light. It is undersaturated. So yes, you get a wide breadth of shading, but it's... It does have some unexpectedly nice water resistance, but I mean... So does Mont Blanc Oyster Gray. Is this more expensive? I think it is per milliliter, but honestly, you know, here we get the fun contrast of like almost gold with the purple, and we still get some water resistance. And even this is usually it is often too light for me to comfortably read, but it's still miles darker than this. So yeah, anyways, there you go for your consideration from the Triple N Network. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching. Bye.